The wind cut across the frozen river, carrying with it a sharp chill that seemed to seep into my bones despite the heavy uniform. I adjusted my scarf, glancing toward the bridge ahead. Its steel frame loomed against the night sky, silhouetted by the dim moonlight, a solitary structure connecting two war-torn lands. It was my post, my responsibility, a lifeline for military operations, and nothing else as far as my superiors were concerned. When I was assigned here, they told me it was an honor. Guard the bridge. Let no one cross without clearance. It seemed simple enough, a straightforward task that didn't require much thought. But they hadn't told me what it would feel like to stand here, night after night, hearing the faint echo of gunfire in the distance, knowing the bridge was more than just a tactical asset. It was a barrier between survival and despair. I scanned the barren landscape, my breath forming small clouds in the icy air. The river below was frozen solid, glinting faintly under the moonlight, its surface as lifeless as the land it divided. The only sound was the occasional creak of the bridge's steel beams, shifting in the cold, and the faint rustle of the wind through the trees. It was late, hours past the time when anything usually stirred, when I saw her. At first, it was just a shadow moving at the edge of the forest, slipping between the trees, cautious but determined. I gripped my rifle instinctively, the weight of it a reminder of my duty. As the figure drew closer, I could make out more. A woman, her frame slight, bundled in tattered clothing. She clutched something close to her chest, something small and fragile. A baby. She stopped at the edge of the bridge, her wide eyes scanning the structure, her body taut with fear. For a moment, she hesitated, as if debating whether to turn back. But then, with a deep breath, she stepped forward, her movements careful, deliberate, as if the bridge itself might betray her. "Stop," I called out, my voice firm but quiet, not wanting to draw attention. She froze, her eyes locking onto mine. They were filled with terror, but also something else, desperation. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. "I have to cross. My baby. She won't survive the night on this side. There's shelter, food on the other side. Please." My training kicked in, the rules clear in my mind. Civilians weren't allowed to cross without authorization. Any breach had to be reported immediately. But as I looked at her, at the thin scarf wrapped around her face, the way her hands shook as she held the baby close, I hesitated. "Do you have papers?" I asked, my voice steady. She shook her head, tears forming in her eyes. "I have nothing. Only her," she said, her voice breaking as she gestured to the bundle in her arms. "Please. She's all I have left." I hesitated, the weight of the rifle in my hands suddenly unbearable. The rules were clear, but so was her desperation. If I turned her away, she and the child wouldn't make it through the night. I thought of the reports I'd heard. Families freezing in abandoned homes, children starving in the woods. "Go," I said quietly, lowering my rifle. Her eyes widened in disbelief. "What?" "Go," I repeated, nodding toward the far side of the bridge. "Quickly, before someone else sees." She didn't need to be told twice. Clutching the baby tightly, she hurried across the bridge, her footsteps light but hurried. I watched as she disappeared into the darkness on the other side, my heart pounding in my chest. When she was gone, I turned back to my post, my grip tightening on the rifle. What had I just done? For the rest of the night, I couldn't shake the image of her. The fear in her eyes, the way she clutched the child as if her life depended on it, and maybe it had. Over the next few nights, I remained vigilant, half expecting a reprimand or worse. But no one came. No one knew what I had done. And then, just as I was beginning to think it was a one-time event, I saw another figure. A man this time limping, his leg wrapped in a bloodied bandage. He didn't even make it to the bridge before collapsing in the snow. I ran to him, kneeling beside his shivering form. He looked up at me, his face pale, his lips cracked from the cold. "Please," he rasped. "They're after me. I need to cross." Again, the rules flashed in my mind. Again, I felt the weight of the rifle. And again, I lowered it. "Go," I said, helping him to his feet, guiding him to the bridge. He crossed slowly, his limp pronounced, his breath shallow. When he reached the other side, he turned back, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered before disappearing into the night. And so it began. Over the next few weeks, more came. A woman with a young boy who clung to her side, his face pale with hunger. An old man carrying nothing but a small bag, his shoulders hunched against the cold. Each one had a story, of loss, of survival, of hope. And each time I found myself making the same choice. The bridge, once a symbol of division, had become something else. For those who came in the night, it was a path to safety, to survival, to a chance at something beyond the devastation of war. And for me, it had become a secret burden, a quiet rebellion against the cruelty of the world around me. But every time I lowered my rifle, every time I let someone pass, I knew the risk I was taking. The bridge was watched, monitored. My actions wouldn't remain hidden forever. And when they were discovered, I would face a choice, one that would force me to decide not just what I stood for, but who I truly was. For now, I stood guard, the silent bridgekeeper, the moonlight my only witness. And as the wind howled across the frozen river, I resolved to hold the line, for as long as I could. The pattern continued, night after night. Each figure who appeared at the edge of the bridge carried with them a story, one more desperate than the last. A family of 4, bundled in mismatched layers, their children too weak to speak. A young man whose hands trembled from exhaustion as he begged for passage. An elderly couple leaning on each other for support, their eyes hollow but hopeful. Each time I felt the same pull, the rules whispering in one ear and the voices of these strangers in the other. I had memorized the regulations during my training. The bridge is a strategic asset. Civilians are not allowed to cross. Any breach is to be reported immediately. But as I watched them stumble forward, the frost clinging to their clothes, the fear in their eyes mirrored my own, an unspoken understanding that the war had taken far more than it had given. So I let them pass. I started keeping count, though the numbers felt hollow. 11 people in the first week. By the second, that number had doubled. Some nights, no one came, and the silence of the bridge pressed down on me, its emptiness more suffocating than the cold. On other nights, I barely had time to return to my post before another figure emerged from the shadows, pleading for help. They always thanked me, a whispered thank you, a nod, a glance filled with gratitude that spoke more than words ever could. And then they disappeared into the darkness, the bridge becoming their lifeline to safety. But not every encounter went as planned. It was late, well past midnight, when I heard the crunch of snow under hurried footsteps. I gripped my rifle, my breath fogging in the cold as I squinted toward the movement. A man emerged, his face pale, his hands trembling as he held them up in a gesture of surrender. "Please," he gasped. "They're close. They'll find me if I don't cross." His words were rushed, panicked. Before I could respond, I heard it. A distant shout, the unmistakable bark of orders. Someone was coming. I grabbed the man by the arm, pulling him behind the steel support of the bridge, motioning for him to stay silent. Moments later, 3 soldiers appeared on the opposite end of the bridge, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. "Have you seen anyone?" one of them barked, his voice sharp and commanding. I stood tall, forcing my voice to remain steady. "No one has crossed tonight," I said, my heart pounding in my chest. The soldiers exchanged glances, their flashlights sweeping over the bridge. One of them stepped closer, his gaze narrowing as he looked at me. "Keep it that way," he said, his tone laced with suspicion. "Command doesn't take breaches lightly." I nodded, gripping my rifle tightly as they turned and disappeared into the darkness, their boots crunching against the frozen ground. When the sound of their footsteps faded, I turned to the man hiding behind the steel beam. He was shaking, his breaths coming in shallow gasps. "Go," I whispered, my voice urgent. "Now." He didn't hesitate. He stumbled across the bridge, glancing back only once before vanishing into the forest on the other side. That night, sleep was impossible. I sat at my post, staring out at the frozen river, the weight of what I had done pressing heavily on my chest. The soldier's words echoed in my mind, a grim reminder that I was playing a dangerous game. The following nights, I found myself watching the forest more carefully, my senses heightened. I was no longer just a soldier guarding a bridge. I was a smuggler of hope, a quiet conspirator in a war that seemed to strip away humanity at every turn. The people I helped began leaving behind small tokens of gratitude, items I didn't ask for, but couldn't bring myself to refuse. A scarf, knitted and warm, left draped over the railing. A small carving of a bird, its wings spread wide, placed carefully at my post. A handful of dried berries, wrapped in cloth, left on the bridge where I stood guard. I kept the items hidden, tucked away in the corners of my barracks where no one would notice. They were reminders of the lives I had touched, the people who had placed their trust in me, even when it could cost me everything. But the bridge had its own voice, its own secrets. One night, as I stood watch, I noticed movement on the far side. This time, it wasn't a lone figure or a family. It was a boy, no older than 10, carrying a bundle twice his size. He staggered toward the bridge, his breaths visible in the freezing air, his steps faltering. I rushed to meet him, dropping to one knee as he reached me. His face was pale, his lips blue, and his hands were red and raw from the cold. He clutched the bundle tightly, his small body trembling. "Please," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "It's my sister. She's sick. I need to get her to the other side." I pulled back the cloth of the bundle, revealing a girl, no older than 6, her face gaunt, her eyes closed. Her chest rose and fell faintly, her breaths shallow and labored. "There's a doctor on the other side," the boy continued, his voice breaking. "They said he can help. Please, let us pass." My hands shook as I helped him lift the bundle, the girl's fragile weight barely noticeable. I didn't need to think. The decision had already been made. "Follow me," I said, leading them across the bridge, my heart pounding with every step. When we reached the other side, I knelt beside him, adjusting the bundle to make it easier for him to carry. "Go quickly," I urged, "and don't look back." The boy nodded, tears streaming down his face as he whispered, "Thank you." As I watched him disappear into the trees, I felt a strange mix of relief and fear. Each person I helped was a victory, but it brought me closer to the moment when I would be discovered. And I knew that moment was coming. The bridge wasn't silent anymore. Its secrets were beginning to unravel, and the choice I had been avoiding would soon demand an answer. The bridge had become a living thing, carrying the weight of secrets and stories I dared not speak aloud. Each step I took across its steel beams felt heavier, the knowledge of what I had done, and what I continued to do, pressing down on me. But the faces of those I had helped lingered in my mind. The young boy with his sick sister, The old couple who had shuffled across with nothing but their love for each other to keep them warm, the desperate mother clutching her child. Each night, I asked myself the same question. How long can this last? The first crack in my fragile operation came during an early morning patrol. I was returning to the barracks after a long, sleepless shift when one of the other guards approached me, his face drawn with suspicion. "You've been spending a lot of time alone out there," he said, his tone casual but edged with accusation. I shrugged, keeping my expression neutral. "It's the post. Quiet, boring. Not much else to do." He narrowed his eyes. "You sure about that?" I heard command asking about unusual activity near the bridge. "They're sending someone to check it out." My chest tightened, but I forced myself to remain calm. "Probably just rumors," I said, brushing past him. But his words stayed with me, a warning I couldn't ignore. If command was sending someone to investigate, it meant they suspected something. And if they discovered the truth? That night, as I stood at my post, I felt the weight of every decision I had made. The cold seemed sharper, the wind harsher, as if the bridge itself was warning me that time was running out. I was startled from my thoughts by the sound of footsteps. They were soft, cautious, but distinct against the frozen ground. I turned toward the far side of the bridge, my rifle ready, and saw a figure emerging from the shadows. A young woman, her face pale and bruised, her clothes torn. She stumbled forward, clutching a small bundle to her chest. "Please," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Help me." As she drew closer, I saw that the bundle was a small child, no older than 3, his face buried against her shoulder. I motioned for her to stop, my heart pounding. "Do you know what you're risking?" I asked, my voice low. Tears filled her eyes, and she nodded. "I have no choice," she said. They're coming for us. He's all I have left." I glanced over my shoulder, my mind racing. Letting her cross was dangerous enough, but if command was already suspicious, this could be the final mistake that exposed everything. Still, I couldn't bring myself to turn her away. "Come on," I said quietly, gesturing for her to follow. I led her across the bridge, my nerves on edge with every step, expecting at any moment to hear the shout of a patrol or the crack of a rifle. But the night remained silent, the wind masking our footsteps as we reached the other side. "Go," I urged, my voice urgent. "Don't stop until you're safe." She hesitated, her eyes wide with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered before disappearing into the trees. When I returned to my post, my chest felt tight, my breath shallow. The line I had been walking had grown thinner, more precarious. The following morning, a convoy arrived at the bridge. 2 officers stepped out of the lead vehicle, their polished boots crunching against the snow. One of them, a tall man with a sharp gaze, approached me, his expression unreadable. "We've received reports of unauthorized crossings," he said, his tone clipped. "You've been on this post for weeks. What have you seen?" My heart pounded, but I kept my voice steady. "Nothing unusual, sir. It's been quiet." His eyes narrowed, studying me. "We'll be monitoring the area more closely from now on," he said. "If anything irregular happens, you'll report it immediately." "Understood." "Yes, sir," I replied, forcing myself to meet his gaze. As they inspected the bridge, I felt the walls closing in. The quiet freedom I had found in helping others was slipping away, replaced by the suffocating weight of their watchful eyes. That night, as I stood at my post, the wind howling around me, I thought of the people who had crossed, the lives I had saved, the risks I had taken. Each act of defiance had felt like a small victory, a way to push back against the cruelty of war. But now, those victories seemed fragile. their consequences looming larger than ever. I didn't have long to dwell on it. Movement at the edge of the forest caught my eye, and I tensed, raising my rifle. A man emerged, limping heavily, his face pale and drawn. "Stop!" I called, my voice sharper than usual. He froze, his hands raised, his eyes wide with fear. "Please," he said, his voice hoarse. "I've come so far. Don't turn me back." My mind raced. The officer's words echoed in my head, their warning clear. If I let him cross and they found out, it wouldn't just be my post I'd lose. It would be my life. But as I looked at him, at the desperation in his eyes, I felt the familiar pull. He was just one man, one life. But wasn't that enough? I lowered my rifle, gesturing for him to follow. "Quickly," I said, my voice low. He nodded, his movements slow but purposeful as he crossed the bridge. When he reached the other side, he turned back, his voice filled with quiet gratitude. "Thank you," he said. "You've done more than you know." As I watched him disappear into the trees, I felt a pang of guilt and fear. I had made my choice again and again, but I couldn't ignore the growing certainty that it was only a matter of time before the bridge, and everything it had come to represent would betray me. I turned back to my post, the wind biting at my face, the darkness pressing in, and I resolved, for however long I had left, to hold the line. The bridge, once a place of silent defiance, now felt like a noose tightening around my neck. The officers' inspections had become more frequent, their questions sharper, their gazes more piercing. I had memorized their patterns, when they arrived, how long they stayed, what areas they checked. Still, every time I let someone cross, the risk grew. I told myself it didn't matter. Each life saved was worth it. But the cost was growing heavier. One evening, as the first shadows of dusk stretched across the snow, a young man approached the bridge. His steps were hesitant, his face pale, and his hands clutched a satchel to his chest. I watched him from a distance, my rifle slung over my shoulder, my breath fogging in the cold air. "Stop," I called out, my voice firm. He froze, his eyes darting toward me. "I'm not armed," he said quickly, raising his hands. I stepped closer, my boots crunching against the frozen ground. "What's in the bag?" "Documents," he said. "For my family. They're on the other side. I have to get this to them." His voice trembled, and I could see the faint quiver in his hands. The satchel was worn, its edges frayed, but he clutched it as if it held his very soul. "Do you have clearance?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. He shook his head, his eyes filled with desperation. "Please," he whispered. "If they don't get these, it's all we have left. I've risked everything to get this far." My pulse quickened as I scanned the area. The officers' inspections had been unpredictable lately, and I couldn't afford a mistake. But as I looked at him, at the weight of hope and fear in his expression, I knew I couldn't turn him away. "Come on," I said quietly, nodding toward the bridge, "but move quickly." He hesitated, as if he couldn't believe I'd agreed, before darting toward the bridge. His footsteps were quick, his breath visible in the freezing air. I followed him, keeping an eye on the surrounding shadows, my rifle ready. When we reached the other side, he turned to me, his voice breaking as he whispered, "Thank you. You don't know what this means." "Go," I said, motioning toward the forest, "and don't look back." He nodded, disappearing into the trees as quickly as he'd come. I returned to my post, my chest tight, the weight of my choices pressed heavier than ever. The next morning, the officers arrived earlier than usual. I was still at my post, my breath sharp in the icy air, when their convoy pulled up. 3 of them stepped out this time, their boots crunching against the snow as they approached. "You've been busy," one of them said, his tone laced with suspicion. I stiffened. "Sir?" The officer held up a piece of cloth, a scarf, one of the tokens left behind by the people I had helped. My heart sank. "This was found near the bridge," he said, his gaze narrowing. "Explain." I forced myself to stay calm, my mind racing. "It's not mine," I said, my voice steady. "Could have been dropped by a patrol." The officer studied me for a long moment before stepping closer, his voice low. "We've received reports of unauthorized crossings. Civilians, refugees. Someone's been letting them through." My grip on my rifle tightened. "I've seen no one, sir." He leaned in, his gaze cold. "I hope that's true, because if it's not, you'll pay for it." I nodded, keeping my expression neutral. They left shortly after, their truck rumbling back across the bridge, leaving me alone with the suffocating silence. I knew then that time was running out. That night, I stood at the edge of the bridge, the cold wind biting at my face. The forest beyond was silent, the shadows still. I thought of the people I had helped, the lives I had saved, and I thought of what would happen if I were caught. I heard footsteps behind me and turned sharply, my rifle raised. But it wasn't an officer or a soldier. It was Vasily. He stepped forward, his small frame wrapped in a tattered coat, his face pale but determined. "What are you doing here?" I hissed, lowering my rifle. "I need your help," he said, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. "My mother is hurt. She can't move. We need to get her to the other side." My heart clenched. I knew what he was asking, knew what it would cost. "Vasily," I said softly, kneeling in front of him, "it's dangerous. If they catch me..." Tears welled in his eyes, but he held his ground. "Please," he whispered, "you've helped so many. You can help her too." I stared at him, my chest tight. Every instinct told me to say no, to protect myself. But the thought of turning him away, of leaving his mother behind, was unbearable. "Where is she?" I asked. He pointed toward the edge of the forest. "Not far." I nodded, my decision made. "Wait here." Gripping my rifle, I moved into the trees, following Vasily's directions. I found his mother slumped against a tree, her face pale, her breath shallow. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Can you walk?" I asked. She nodded weakly, and I helped her to her feet, supporting her weight as we made our way back to the bridge. Vasily ran to us as we emerged, his small hands clutching at her arm. "We'll cross together," I said, my voice firm. We moved quickly, every step a risk, every sound a potential threat. But as we reached the far side, relief washed over me. "Go," I said, urging them into the forest. "Don't stop until you're safe." Vasily turned back, his eyes shining with tears. "Thank you," he whispered. As they disappeared into the darkness, I returned to my post, the wind howling around me. The bridge felt heavier than ever, its steel beams creaking under the weight of the secrets it carried. And I knew that my time was almost up. The morning after Vasily and his mother crossed, the officers arrived again. This time, they weren't here to inspect. They were here to confront. Their convoy stopped abruptly, tires crunching on the frozen ground. 4 soldiers stepped out, their rifles slung across their shoulders, followed by the officer with the cold, piercing gaze. He approached me, flanked by his men, his expression unreadable. "Step away from the post," he ordered, his voice sharp. My pulse quickened, but I obeyed, my rifle hanging loose at my side. The officer stopped just a few feet from me, his gaze boring into mine. "We've received confirmation," he said, his tone slow and deliberate. "Someone has been letting civilians cross. Dozens of them." I said nothing, my jaw tightening as I forced myself to remain still. "Do you know what happens to traitors, soldier?" he continued, taking a step closer. "Those who betray their orders, their comrades?" His voice was cold, but it carried a quiet menace, the kind that made my stomach twist. "I haven't betrayed anyone," I said evenly, though my voice felt like it might crack under the weight of the lie. The officer smirked, a cruel glint in his eyes. "We'll see." He turned to one of the soldiers at his side. "Search the area. Leave nothing untouched." The men spread out, their boots pounding against the steel of the bridge, their eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. I stood rigid, my heart pounding as they moved closer to the hiding place where I had tucked away the tokens. The scarf, the carving, the scraps of gratitude left by those I'd helped. It didn't take long for them to find it. The soldier returned, holding up the items, his expression triumphant. The officer turned back to me, his smile cold and razor-sharp. "Care to explain?" I clenched my fists, my mind racing for an excuse, a way to explain the unexplainable. But there was no use. They had their proof. "You've been aiding the enemy," the officer said, his voice cutting through the cold air. "You've put this post, this entire operation, at risk." "They're not the enemy," I snapped before I could stop myself. The words escaped like a reflex, my voice firm and full of defiance. The officer raised an eyebrow, his smirk widening. "Interesting," he said. "And who, exactly, are they to you?" I took a deep breath, my heart hammering in my chest. "They're people," I said. "Mothers, children, families trying to survive. Not spies, not soldiers, just people." The soldiers shifted uncomfortably, glancing at each other, but the officer's expression remained cold. "You've forgotten your duty," he said, stepping closer, his voice low and venomous. "Your orders were clear. You don't get to decide who lives or dies. That's above you." For a moment, the silence was deafening. Then he straightened, motioning to the soldiers. "Take him," he said. Two men grabbed my arms, their grips firm as they pulled me toward the convoy. I didn't fight them, though my body tensed with every step. But as they reached the vehicle, I heard a voice. "Wait!" I turned sharply, my breath catching as I saw Vasily standing at the edge of the forest. His small figure was framed against the trees, his eyes wide with fear, his breath visible in the cold. Behind him, other figures emerged. Men, women, children. All of them stepping forward, their faces filled with determination. The officer's expression darkened. "Who are they?" he demanded, his hand moving to the sidearm at his belt. "They're the ones I helped," I said, my voice steady. Vasily stepped closer, his small voice rising above the wind. "He saved us," he said, his words strong despite the fear in his eyes. "He saved all of us." One by one, the others stepped forward, their voices joining his. "He let us cross. He gave us hope. He saved my child." The soldiers hesitated, their grips loosening as they exchanged uncertain glances. Even the officer seemed momentarily thrown, his confidence faltering under the weight of the crowd's testimony. I turned to him, my voice calm but unyielding. "These are the lives you call the enemy," I said, gesturing to the group. "These are the people I've been helping. If that makes me a traitor, then so be it." The officer's jaw tightened, his hand hovering near his weapon. But before he could act, one of the soldiers stepped forward, his voice quiet but firm. "Sir," he said, glancing at the crowd, "if we take him, we'll be taking the only good thing left in this place." The officer's gaze snapped to the soldier, his eyes narrowing. For a moment, the tension was unbearable, the silence stretching as he weighed his decision. Finally, he let out a sharp breath, lowering his hand. "You're all fools," he muttered, turning back toward the convoy. "Let him rot here with the rest of them." With that, he climbed into the vehicle, the soldiers following reluctantly. The engines roared to life, and the convoy disappeared across the bridge, leaving me standing in stunned silence. Vasily ran to me, his small arms wrapping tightly around my waist. "You're safe," he whispered, his voice trembling. I knelt, resting a hand on his shoulder. "We're all safe," I said, my voice thick with emotion. The villagers gathered around, their faces filled with relief and gratitude. For the first time in weeks, the weight on my chest lifted, replaced by a sense of peace I hadn't thought possible. The bridge remained, silent and steadfast, but it was no longer just a post. It was a symbol of resistance, of hope, of the quiet acts of courage that had saved so many. And as the crowd dispersed, their voices soft but filled with life, I turned back to the bridge, my place of duty, knowing I had fulfilled a greater purpose than I had ever imagined.